This week on NCTV, we hit the road. The home you see there behind me is Ivy Green in Tuscumbia, Alabama. It's the childhood home of Helen Keller. Keller was born totally healthy, but her life changed dramatically before she was 2 years old.
Helen Keller was born in 1880 here in Tuscumbia, Alabama. A normal child to Captain and Mrs. Keller. For 18 months, she was normal. She had a very high fever that left her deaf and blind. They said it could have been measles or scarlet fever. They really never determined what it caused the actual blindness and deafness. Helen Keller, for several years, roamed around the grounds here in Tuscumbia. The plantation was 640 acres. It was built in 1820 by Helen Keller's grandfather. So for several years, Helen's mother and father did not know how to cope with the child who had become deaf and blind. And Captain Keller did a lot of research. He actually taught with Alexander Graham Bell, and Alexander Graham Bell told him about Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan went to school at Perkins in Boston. So he got in touch with Perkins, and they asked if Anne Sullivan could come here to Tuscumbia. So in 1887, Anne Sullivan arrived here in Tuscumbia. At our local depot here in Tuscumbia, we still have the train depot here. She came, and for several weeks, she kind of evaluated Helen. Then she realized that she had to get Helen away from the family because Helen was so spoiled. She was accustomed to getting her way. And so one morning in the dining room, Helen decided that she was going to eat from everyone's plate. And when she got to Anne Sullivan's plate, Anne said no. So Helen started throwing a temper tantrum. So she threw food on the floor. She broke some of the dishes. So Anne Sullivan told the parents, she said, in order for me to get control of Helen, I've got to take her away. And of course, Captain Keller said, no way, you know. And she said, oh, just next door. And he said, oh, well, okay, that'll be fine. So they put her in the carriage and they drove her all around the plantation. And it took them several hours. Helen thought she was going far away, but she was actually just coming next door to the main house, to the cottage. So for several weeks, they remained in the little cottage without the presence of Helen's mother and father. They could look in through the window, but they could not come around to see her. And so for several weeks, they remained there. And then Helen and Anne Sullivan came back into the main house. And sure as they got seated around the dining room table, Helen began to throw her temper tantrums, and Anne Sullivan at that point decided, okay, I've had enough. So she took her out to the back to the water pump, and she began to spill water into Helen's hand. For several events, Helen didn't understand. And then all of a sudden, it was like a light switch. It came on. And she learned her first word, water, at the water pump. And she actually learned 30 words that afternoon.
And when that happened, what was the reaction from her parents and Annie Sullivan?
Well, first, Anne Sullivan could not believe that Helen had actually understood that the water that was flowing over her hand was what Helen was spelling, water. So she began to call out to Captain and Mrs. Keller, and she said, come, a miracle has happened. So, of course, the parents and the aunt and the brother, they went out the back, and they saw that Helen actually, she began to say Papa, Mama, and spell that into Helen's hand, and she knew who she was talking with.
Talk about Helen after she had that breakthrough miracle that you talked about. What happened after that in her life as she became a young adult and then an adult in her later years as well?
Of course, there were no schools for the deafblind in the South. We have a wonderful school in Talladega. It's called the Alabama Institute for the Deafblind. But back in the 1880s, there were no, that school, you had to be blind or deaf. You could not have two disabilities. So that's the reason Helen had to go to Boston, to Perkins School. So she went on to Perkins, and she would come back every summer and during winter vacations as long as the family lived here. And then she went to Radcliffe College, and that was a very big obstacle because they did not want to admit her into Radcliffe College because of her disability. And so they made Helen take several tests without Annie Sullivan being by her side. And she scored so extremely high that they could not refuse her to come to that school. Helen, of course, began to write, and she loved writing, and she loved lecturing. And so after she graduated from Radcliffe, the American Foundation for the Blind invited her to come to work for them in New York. So Helen went there, and she began her journey throughout the world, speaking on behalf of the disabled. And so the barriers that we see today that's coming down, I think it's from the groundwork that Helen Keller actually did in the early 1900s.
Was it difficult for people to understand her since she was deaf and probably wasn't able to speak clearly after she started lecturing?
You had to listen very closely to her, but you could understand. From what I understand, they were very protective of Helen in her speaking engagements. But we have a recording out in the Lions Club Memorial, and it is a speech that Helen Keller gave to the Lions International in 1925 when she asked them to become the Knights for the Blind. So the work that you see around the world that the Lions Clubs are doing, that is because Helen Keller asked them to step on board and be the Knights for the Blind.
Of course, we're talking inside inside Ivy Green, the place where she grew up. Let's talk about this house a little bit on the inside. What can you see if you've never been here before, if you're visiting for the first time? What can you see when you come in this home?
Well, the home was built in 1820 by her grandfather, David Keller. We have 85% of the furnishings belong to the Keller family. Every so often, a member of the family will pass away or decide to go ahead and donate a piece of furniture. So we hope one day to have it 100%, but right now it's just at 85%. But you will be able to have a guided tour through the main house. We have docents that will greet you and give you a guided tour. It doesn't look like there's an upstairs when you arrive here, but we have 4 rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs. We have Captain and Mrs. Keller's bedroom. We have the parlor, the dining room, and the museum room, which was a bedroom when Helen Keller lived here. That was her Aunt Eveline's bedroom. Upstairs, we have the boys' room, and then down the hallway is Annie Sullivan's room. And the children always like for us to tell the story about when Ann Sullivan came one afternoon. Helen got mad at the teacher, and she locked the room. She locked Ann Sullivan up in the room, and then she came downstairs and hid the key, and they couldn't find it. So Captain Keller had to get a ladder, and he had to climb out that up to the window, and Ann climbed out.
Wow. So she was a tad mischievous in those years.
Yes, very much so.
Talk about what's in there. What can people see when they go inside the museum room?
The main thing is the statue that's now in the museum room. It's just like the one in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. A few years ago, Governor Riley replaced one of the statues with Helen Keller. And so now they will be able to see Helen Keller at the water pump. And around the base of the statue, it's Braille. And we have a lot of deaf and blind people to visit here, and it's very important for them to feel the Braille in the museum room. But there's books, there's letters, there's all kind of pictures. People love, they can spend 30 minutes just in there looking around. We have beautiful grounds now here at the birthplace of Helen Keller, thanks to the master gardeners. They have taken us on as a project, so they're always working on the grounds. People love to come and just walk around. But outside you will see the kitchen, the cook's bedroom, the pump where she learned her first word. And I often say that pump speaks many languages. Because we actually have visitors from all over the world that visit the Helen Keller birthplace. And when they walk outside, the first thing they see is the pump, and they begin to speak in their language. I mean, they really get into it, and they start snapping photographs and all. So they know very much what the pump stands for. We have an ice house, and also the birthplace cottage where she was born. That is also where Ann Sullivan took her away from the family to teach her manners. We have the Lions Club Memorial. Those are gifts sent from all over the world in her honor. And we even have a moon tree in the back. They took the seed to the moon and brought it back and planted it. So now it's a large pine tree. She died June 1st, 1968, shortly before her 88th birthday. She died the same week that Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated. So his death really overshadowed hers. She retired. She lived in Connecticut her last 8 years of her life with a nurse. She had had several strokes.
And how beneficial would you say she has been to the deaf and blind community in our country? I mean, how much significance does she play in people accepting the deaf and the blind today?
I think that Helen Keller has really and truly touched everyone's life, no matter if you have a disability or not. But we have people from many walks of life that comes through that have just found out that their child is deaf or blind or other disabilities. They come here for inspiration. You know, she touched lives throughout the world, and but she wanted everyone to know that you may have a disability, but there's not anything that you can't do. We have just started a new program here at the Helen Keller Birthplace. It's called Camp Courage, a Helen Keller experience. And this past September, we had 12 blind or deaf students to attend the camp. And one parent came up to me on Friday night and he said, I just want you to know that for the first time in my son's life, I have watched him interact with other children, feel a part, and a smile on his face that I've never seen. And that's what that camp is all about, is touching lives of children with disabilities, you know. And we always stress, you may be blind or deaf, but if you set your mind to it, there's not anything that you can't do.
The Helen Keller home is located at 300 North Commons Street in Tuscumbia, Alabama. It's open Monday through Saturday from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. Next week on NCTV, we'll stay in the state of Alabama as we head to Huntsville to learn all about the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. Reporting from Tuscumbia, Alabama, Barry Hiett, NCTV.